Today's daf is daf Hey, and we'll start with the Mishnah on the bottom of daf Daled Amud Beis. I'm not sure if we'll read every word in the Mishnah and the Gemara because I just want to have an easy takeoff. So the Mishnah is talking about a case where the Beis Din issued a ruling that was erroneous, and based on that ruling, the the community of Israel violated, let's say, for example, an Isur Chelev, which is an Isur Kares. And the Mishnah establishes that they have to bring what's called a Par Helim Dovashel Sibur. The Mishnah stipulates that both the court and the people who followed the ruling of the court were all shogegim. In other words, they were not deliberate in their crime. However, the Mishnah goes on to tell us that if they were mezidim, and again, it's hard to imagine that the Beis Din would be deliberate about tripping up the Jewish people. I don't know. Maybe they were hired for it. I don't know what it was. Then there are two scenarios discussed, addressed to the Mishnah. One is where the Beis Din was mezidim and the kahal was shogegim, or the reverse. The kahal was shogegim and the court was mezidim. So first we'll take the case where the court was mezidim and the people were shogegim. So in that case, their status is not that of a regular carbon par helim dovashel tzibur, but rather, instead of a par, they bring a se'ira. A se'ira is brought, a female, as a carbon chatos. So it's like a personal, private chatos rather than a public par. And the reason for that is because they can't hide behind the toes, the mistake of Beis Din, because Beis Din in this case were mezidin, even though they were shogegim. Now we have the flip case where the court itself was shogegim, but the congregation, the people in the community, they were mezidim, meaning they couldn't care less about the issue of the ruling of Beis Din. They weren't following Beis Din. They, on their own, decided they want to eat chelev, chas v'sholem. And once again, there's no par helim dovashel tzibur. The par helim dovashel tzibur will only apply in the following conditions: that both the court that issued this mistaken ruling and the people who inadvertently, because they were relying on the Beis Din, they violated the issur. Then we bring a carbon par helim dovashel tzibur. Now the Gemara analyzes that, and we're going to see that in the Mishnah, when we have a case where, let's say, the court issued a mistaken ruling and only most of the people of Israel violated that Isur Kares, meaning ate chelev, then nevertheless the Mishnah establishes there is a par helim dovashel tzibur. So we don't need a situation which every last member of the community violated this Isur and relying on the erroneous decision of Beis Din ate chelev, but it's enough if it's just a majority. Now the Mishnah goes on to discuss a case where there was a ruling of the Beis Din Gadol of the High Court to violate idolatry, avodah zarah. And Rabbi Meir is going to say that in this case of avodah zarah, there's something very unique. Instead of the regular, just bring a par and that would be sufficient, you have to also bring a sa'ir. So that's Rabbi Meir's opinion, that we jack up a case of avodah zarah to a higher level. And Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah disagrees. And we're summarizing now the last line on Daf Daled Amud Beis, so we can have an easy takeoff for Daf Hey, our Daf for today. Rabbi Yehuda says that in the case of chelev, for example, if, let's say, 12 tribes of Israel violated the Isur Chelev, based on the erroneous, mistaken ruling of the Bezdin, then each one of the tribes is called a kohol. Each shevet is a kohol unto itself and has to bring its own carbon helim davar, par helim davar shel tzibur. In a case where the each one of the shvatim violated idolatry, avodas kochavim, then again, following very similar to Rabbi Meir as we saw earlier, but in this case you have to multiply it by 12 because each one of the tribes has to bring its own carbon, and therefore all told there will be 12 parim. And then we said that in idolatry there's an additional carbon called a sa'ir, and now they have to bring 12 sa'irim. And this leads us to the second half of the Mishnah, which is on the top of Daf Hey Amud Aleph. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, you know what? I agree with you, Rabbi Yehuda, in your debate against Rabbi Meir, and I hold that every shevet has to bring its own carbon, its own par helim davar shel tzibur. But I want to jack it up by one additional par, and that's the court itself. The Bezdin, because they issued this mistaken ruling that caused Klal Yisrael to violate the Torah, therefore they have to bring a carbon. And that's called a par helim davar shel tzibur, and therefore we add 12 to 1, and we get Shlosh Parim 13. Ba'avodas kochavim, we're going to again add 1 above Rabbi Yehuda's calculation of 12 parim and 12 se'irim, and we end up with 12, with 13 parim and 13 se'irim. Par v'soil kol shevet v'shevet, and par v'soil bezdin. So whereas Rabbi Yehuda would agree that par v'soil l'chol shevet v'shevet, each shevet is a community of itself and generates its own chiyuv of both the par in the case of all other sins and add the soyer in the case of idolatry. But according to Reb Shimon, we have to add another carbon which is brought by the bezdin themselves. Horu bezdin v'asu shiva shvatim o ruban al piem. If let's say it was either the majority of the tribes, which means 7 tribes, or it was a smaller number of tribes, but these tribes were highly populated, and therefore you end up with either rov shvatim or rov of Klal Yisrael. In either case, meviim par, there will be a par helim davar shel tzibur, and again in avodas kochavim, in addition to the par, you bring a soy divrei Rabbi Meir. Now, according to Rabbi Meir, if 7 shvatim, for example, violated chelev, relying on the psak of Bezdin, the other 5 shvatim are off the hook, because at the end of the day they didn't need chelev. Comes along Rabbi Yehuda with a principle called greira. What's greira? Shiva shvatim shechatu. If 7 out of 12 tribes, which is the majority of the shvatim, violated the Isser Karis of Achilas Chelev, then Meviim Shiva Parim. But what about the other 5 Shvatim? We said that according to Rabbi Meir, they're off the hook entirely. Comes along Rabbi Yehuda, he says, Shavash Shvatim Shalchatu Meviim Al Yedeim Par. And here we're going to apply the principle of Greira, which means that we stretch the chiyuv from the 7 tribes that violated the Isur Chelev and take all the other 5 Shvatim as one entity, and we impose an obligation on those 5 Shvatim to bring a par helim davar shel tzibur. So all told, we can have 8 parim. Sha'af elu shelo chatu meviim al yedei chotin. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Shmona Parim, it would seem that he doesn't want to demand a par from the other 5 Shvatim that were not guilty of violating the Isur Kares of Chelev, but he will jack it up from 7 to 8 because his shita is at the court itself. The Bezdin has their own independent obligation to bring a par helim davar shel tzibur. Pavodas kochavim, shmona parim ushmona seirim. Once again, we said that in addition to the parim of the regular isur, meaning chelev or the like, because there was an idolatry involved, therefore we have to bring a sa'ir. And if there are 7 tribes that violated the isur idolatry, so we have to jack it up according to Reb Shimon from 7 to 8 because the court itself brings 1, and now we have to jack up the seirim from 7 to 8 because of the bezdin. So therefore, par v'soil l'chol sheva, sheva par v'soil bezdin. Next, horu bezdin shel echad min hashvatim v'asa osa shevet al piyem. Let's say there was only one shevet out of the 12 shvatim that violated the isur chelev. And here we introduce another concept. There's a high court in every single shevet. So the high court of that particular shevet issued an erroneous ruling. Based on that ruling, the members of that shevet, and only that shevet, violated an isur chelev. And therefore also shevet hu chayev, that shevet is chayev. However, it's interesting that here Rabbi Yehuda confesses that there's no greira. We're not going to expand it onto the rest of the nation, of the other shvatim, because here it wasn't a case where most of the shvatim violated the isur chelev, but there's only one shevet that violated the isur chelev, and therefore shar shvatim pturim divrei Rabbi Yehuda. So let's just see for a moment if we can figure out what's the difference between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Let's just see. According to Rabbi Meir, one second. Just one second. Just want to get this straight. Yeah, as far as I can tell, the only difference here between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Shimon is that Rabbi Shimon adds another par that has to be brought by the members of the Bezdin. In this case, the Bezdin High Court of that one shevet. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't have that. Chachamim omrim ein chayovin el al Horayos Bezdin agadol bilvad. So that the Chachamim, and this is very similar to what we said in Rabbi Yehuda, they deny the status of the high court of that particular shevet. The only erroneous decision of a bezdin that could generate a chiyuv of par helim devdor is only the bezdin agadol that sat in Yerushalayim. The private batei dinim of each shevet, even if it's the highest court in that shevet, could not generate a chiyuv par helim devdor shel tzibur. Shenemar, because in the parsha of Par Helim Dover Shetzibur, it says, V'im kol adas Yisrael yishku, the entire assembly of Israel erred, implying V'lo adas oso hashevet. That it means that forget about the bezdin of that shevet. No. The Torah says, Kol adas Yisrael. And Kol adas Yisrael means all the shvatim together and not that particular shevet. So again, that shevet that sinned, based on an erroneous decision of the court, that shevet per se does not have to bring, according to Chachamim, a par helim davar shel tzibur. Why? Because it's an individual shevet, and we don't view the court within that shevet as representing a kal to be mechayev a carbon parhelm dov shutzi, because the Torah says kol adas Yisrael. So basically, according to Chachamim, until you get 7 out of 12 tribes that violated the Isur Chelef, or alternatively, 5 tribes or 1 tribe that's got greater populace than half of the rest of the population, then there's Par Helim Dov Shel Tzibur. If it's only 1 Shevet, there's no Par Helim Dov Shel Tzibur according to the Chachamim. Tana Rabbana, we learned in a Brisa. Yadu shahoru v'to mashahoru. What happens if the court rescinds its decision as soon as they find out that they were mistaken in their ruling? Is yachol yu chayavim? I might think that the tzibur is chayav in a carbon par helim davashal tzibur, and the reason for that is because they realize that they made a mistake. But the case is a lot more complicated. The Brisa doesn't really spell it out, but we're talking about a case where they incorrectly permitted something that the Torah prohibited, and again, they did so a second time around. Yachol yu chayavim. So the Havamina here, this Brisa, is that there should be a chiyuv for a helim dover shel tzibur. Just 1 second. So there were two different horos of Bezdin. And apparently they were both mistaken. Let's say this kind of chelev X and this kind of chelev Y. And the Bezdin issued a ruling mistakenly allowing both X chelev and Y chelev. And the people went ahead and they ate both X and Y chelev. Should we say in such a case that they're chayev a carbon olivio, a carbon par helim dovishal tzibur tavid lomar v'noda hachatos v'lo sheyivadu hachotin. Basically, we don't know which of the two prohibitions that they indulged in, which one was the one that's awesome. One of the two transgressions was certainly due to the court's ruling, for they ruled regarding one of the forbidden items, and the congregation consumed 2 forbidden items. Perhaps then the congregation should be liable to a par helim dover shel tzibur, even though we do not know which transgression was caused by the court. So again, we know that the kahal, the community, certainly violated it, and that should be enough. No, we have to know exactly which sin was violated. Asher cheto, now the Bryce is continuing to dash in the pasuk. Chatu shnei shvatim, meviim shnei parim. So this is the shita of those who argue with Rabbi Meir, and they hold that each tribe Each shevet has to bring its own korban. Chatu shlosha, meviim shlosha. The Brisa now has a dialectic back and forth. O Eino Omer Elachatu Shnei Yechidim Meviim Shnei Parim. Chatu Shlosha Meviim Shlosha. Perhaps we would say that what the pasuk means to say is that if two individual members sinned, then they have to bring a par helen dovashal tzibur. So that it comes out that according to this Havamina, the par helen dovar would apply even to individuals. And that's the O Eno. And therefore, chatu shlosha, meviim shlosha. We have to bring 3 parim keneged corresponding to these 3 people. Talmud lomer hakahol, hakol chayv, hakol hakahol, hakol chayv. Only if you have a community, then they have to bring a par helen dovashal tzibur. But individuals, they don't bring a par helen dovashal tzibur. And every kahal has to bring its own par helen dovashal tzibur. But the fact that an individual would have relied on Bezdin and violated Isa Chalev, that's not in the parsha of Par Helim Dovashal Tzibur. Ketzad. Now the Brisa fleshes it out. Chatu shnei shvatim meviim shnei parim. Chatu shiva meviim shiva. Ushvar shvatim shelo chatu meviim al. This is what I call greira. Meviim al yideim par par. So it means the other shvatim that are basically guiltless, they also will have to bring a par helim dovashal tzibur. Shafilu elu shel chatum meviim al yidei hachotim shenemar lekach nemar kol l'chayv al kol kahal kol divrei Rabbi Yehud. So again, we're now getting back to the machlokas Rabbi Yehuda and Rishimon that we saw in the Mishnah, whether or not we apply the principle of greira in the case where 7 out of 12 shvatim ate chalev, relying on the psak of the court. And Rabbi Yehuda says l'chayv al kol kol v'kol, that even those shvatim that did not actually sin, they too have to bring a par helim dovashal tzibur. But Rabbi Shimon Omer, he disagrees. Shiva shvatim shechatim meviim shiva parim, or if it's one shevet, let one shevet bring the par. Who bezdin meviim al yideim par. This is Rabbi Shimon's unique shita that even bezdin has to bring a par. But that's it. We're not talking about 7 parim. Shenemar lemata kohol. Okay, it says ve'krivu hakahol par ben bakar lechatos v'nemer lemala kahol. And in Pasuk Yud Gimel, it says v'nelam dover mineni hakahol. Ma kahol amar lemala. Just like we saw that in the word kahol lemala, when it says "V'krivu hakol par ben bakar lechatos," is bezdinim hakol. That not only does the kahol have a chiyuv of par helim dovashal tzibur, but also bezdin has to bring one. Af kahal ha'omer lemata. Bezdin im hakol. So this is the unique shita of Rabbi Shimon, that not only does the kol have a chiyuv of par helim shel tzibur, even the bezdin has that chiyuv. Rabbi Meir Omer Shiva Shvatim Shechatu Bezdin Mevim Al Yidem Par Vehem Pturim. Right? We said over and over again that Rabbi Meir doesn't have this individual obligation on the community, such that each community would have to bring its own par, but rather we shift the responsibility over to the Bezdin. So again, since the majority of the congregation followed the erroneous ruling of the Bezdin, therefore the Bezdin has to bring a par helim dovashal tzibur, heim ptur. So even though those 7 shvatim violated the Isur Chelev, they're pot, because they hide behind the decision of the Bezdin that you're allowed to eat these this shum. Chelev. Never call a mata. We never call a mala. This is Reb Meir. Ma kol ha'omer l'mala bezdin v'lo tzibur. According to Rabbi Meir, the main thrust of the obligation of par helm dovashal tzibur is on the bezdin, and not on the congregation. Af kol ha'omer l'mata bezdin v'lo tzibur. So that's the unique sheet of Rabbi Meir, that it's only the Bezdin that brings a par helim dovashal tzibur, and the community itself is completely out of the picture, exonerated. Rav Shimon Elazar Omer Mishmo, in the name of Rabbi Meir, Chatu Shisha Shvatim, Vehem Rubo Shel Kol, even though it's only 6, which is 50%, but they make up a population that's the majority of the people of Israel. Oh, Shiva. What about a case where 7 out of 12 of the Shvat violated an Isur Kares, Afal Pisha Eino Rubo Shel Kol Mivim Par? So what's this all about? Afal Pisha Ein Rubo Shel Kol. Because there's a rove of Shvatim, we don't care whether or not that rove of Shvatim, you calculate and add together all the members of those Shvatim, you'll get a majority of Klal Yisrael. That's not relevant. Omar Mar, we learned in the Brayso Menoda Achatos V'lo Shivadu Hachotim. So even though we know that the people definitely violated, but we're not sure which one they violated, is therefore there's no chiyuv of par helim dovashal tzibur. Man Tana, who's the author of this Mishnah? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Item, others say it was Rava. The Loka Rabbi Eliezer. So this halacha that there's no chiyuv of par helim dovashal tzibur if lo yivadu hachatoim, right? They don't know which sin they violated. Is Rabbi Eliezer, because we learned in the Brayso, Rabbi Eliezer man afshach. Either way you slice the cake, he's liable to korban chatas im chelev achav yed chelev chayev nosar achal chayev. If he eats nosar, that's also nisa kares. So what do we see from Rabbi Eliezer? You don't know precisely which violation you violated. Nevertheless, he has to bring his own chatas, because mimonav shach he ate both of them. So in the case of a chata shel tzibur, even if we don't know which of 2 possible violations were transgressed, Rabbi Eliezer would still maintain that you have to bring a par helim dovashal tzibur. even though he doesn't know exactly precisely which prohibition he violated. Rav Ashi Omer afilu Teimer Rabbi Eliezer Shiny Hacha Dichsiv Asher Chatu Aleha. So Rav Ashi wants to reconcile the Brisa with Rabbi Eliezer, and he says, okay, Rabbi Eliezer says that if we don't know which is the exact violation, then he brings a karma chatos, a private chatos. But here in the case where the tzibur violated the Isur Kares, that's something different. Because Torah says, Asher chatu aleha. And oleh apparently means this particular sin. We can isolate, we can identify the sin. So Gemara says, Hasam nami, haksiv asher chata ba. And the word ba means that he was guilty of a personal transgression of it. What is it? It means he's got to know which one he violated. So if he doesn't know which avera he violated, then he brings a chatos. So what's the Gemara's kasha now? If you are learning the pasuk oleha, then you should learn the pasuk ba. And therefore, from the pasuk ba, we should derive the conclusion that you don't need a precise. Just 1 second. Right, that you should require a precise identification of the sin for a carbon power helim davashal tzibur. Gemara says, "Ahu mi boile." I need the pasuk ba to teach me prat lemisasek. So he was involved in X, and he rolled over in his sleep, so to speak. I'm using that as a proverbially, and he did Y. So in such a case, he's patur. Prat lemisasek. That's not called Asher Chata Ba. So now the Gemara goes back to Rabbi Yehuda. My time of the Rabbi Yehuda. How do we understand the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda? We're going to go through all the Shitas in the Brisa. So we're starting with Rabbi Yehuda. Kasavar arba kahale ksivit. 4 times it says in the Torah the word kahal. I should say, to be more precise, 4 times in the parsha of Parahelim Dovashal Tzibur it says kahal or hakahal. So Rabbi Yehuda now explains the 4. Kahal hakahal. Kol hakahol, right? These are the 4 times. Is chad l'chayv al kol kahal v'kahal. What was the havamina here? That each shevet is chayv its own korban. Chad lahora tluya bebezdin umase toli bekahal, which means that the ruling depends upon bezdin, and the violation of that ruling depends upon the tzibur. But again, at this point, we would assume that everyone is guilty. But now we have a third pasuk, Greira. So even those tribes that were not guilty of the sin, they're schlepped along by the tribes that did violate the Isur. V'chad, still left for the 4th. L'shevet she'osa boras beis dino. Ah, not to say that the Bezdin has to bring the korban parhelim dov shel tzibur, but that if a shevet relied on the decision and the ruling of Bezdin, that shevet has to bring a korban parhelim dov shel tzibur. For Rabbi Shimon, tlosa kol iksivi, there aren't four but three. Hakahol, kol, hakahol. So it sounds like there are only three kahals, and then there's no fourth kahal. However, the pasuk says, "Me'enei hakahol orchei dekrohu." Why does he get rid of that fourth kahal? Because that's the way Dibra Torah v'Losh B'nei Adam. That's the way the Mikra speaks. Kinamri Ichi, people say, Me'ene de Planya, was hidden from the eyes of so-and-so. So what does Rabbi Shimon hold? Chad l'chayvi akol kol v'kol. Now he's got three psukim, the first of which is to generate a chiyuv on each kol. Utrei achrini, and the other two kahals is for Xeris Shav. Nemer lamato kahal. So in the parsha of Parhelim Dovish Tzibur, it says kahal. V'nemer lamala kahal. And also in the parsha where the Bezdin issued an erroneous decision, and the kahal violated that Issa based on that decision. Malahalan, just like there, with regard to the kahal. Bezdin im hakol, right? That's Reb Shimon Shita, that not only does the kahal have to bring the par, but even the Bezdin Afkan here too, Bezdin im hakol, that Bezdin themselves have to bring a par helim dovish shel tzibur. Rabbi Meir, kahal hakahalo darish. He thinks that the extra hakahal is just dibra Torah b'lashon b'nei adam. Hilkach trei kahal iksivu, only left with two, and miboile, he needs them one for l'nemer lamata kahal, v'nemer lamala kahal mala kahal lahalan bezdin v'lo tzibur, is afkan bezdin v'lo tzibur. So it means that the chiyuv of par helim dovish shel tzibur according to Rabbi Meir is incumbent upon the bezdin, not on the call. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, my timer, what was his logic? Ksiv v'hoya im me'enei ha'eda alma mi'uta. It's got to be me'enei ha'eda. Ksiv me'en. Uksiv, in another pasuk says ki l'chola am bishkaga. L'meimer deruba in mi'uta lo. So up to this point, we're talking about the Am, and again, Rubo Kakula, that's why it says in the pasuk Kol Am, but not Miuto. Not if the minority violates the Isur of Cheled. Ha Ketzad, Asu Shisha Vehain Rubo shall call. In other words, who relied on the erroneous decision of the Beis Din? It was Shisha, it was 6 tribes of Israel. And apparently, even though they don't have a majority of the Shvatim, but nevertheless they had the majority of the population of all of Israel. Oh, Shiva, even if they don't have the majority of the population of Israel, but they have 7 Shvatim, Av Pichem Rubu Shel Kol Chayavim. And this is the end of Amud Aleph.